Welcome to the Irish Literary Society's annual Yeats Lecture, the seventh in our series, which is distinguished by being the first ever online event of the Society. In 2014, the then Irish ambassador to the UK, Dan Mulhall, a lifelong Yeats enthusiast, initiated the series for us, and in great part, year on year, we've held closely to the person of the poet himself in the series. Paul Geldof in conversation with Roy Foster, considering Yeats the cultural revolutionary, Cathal Dallat, reflecting on Yeats in Bedford Park, John Kelly considering Yeats's role as national poet. In the 1880s, Yeats's youthful energy would afford him the epithet Yeats the Founder, our society being one of the many he was involved in founding. But of course, he wasn't alone in these efforts. About him were gathered such talented people as Dora Sigerson Shorter, John Todhunter, T.W. Rolleston, and Francis Fahey, who did much of the practical business that such initiatives require. A similar coalition occurred in what the Vice President of our Society, Professor Roy Foster, has called the great ennobling relationship of his life, Yeats's relationship with Lady Augusta Gregory. The intimacy and extensive collaboration of their working relationship leaves the critical portioning of one's work from the others a very uncertain business. But certainly greater acknowledgement is now given to Lady Gregory's part as co-author with Yeats, most familiarly in Cathleen New Houlihan, which Yeats called that play of mine that sent out certain men the English shot, and also more attention to Gregory's own writing. This evening is about Augusta Gregory's life and work, and the work of the extraordinary Druid Theatre Company, acclaimed since its earliest years, and now world-renowned as exemplary interpreters of Irish drama. We're delighted to welcome to the Society the Director of Druid, Garry Hynes, to discuss their recent season of 5 of Lady Gregory's one-act plays, which quite audaciously achieved a tour during these restricted times. DruidGregory, of course, follows on those extraordinary seasons: Druid Synge, Druid Murphy, Druid Yeats, and Druid Shakespeare. It's exalted company, but we might remember that Bernard Shaw saluted Gregory as a dramatist comparable to Molière, whom she translated for the stage. Joining Garry will be Colm Tóibín, a board member of Druid, and of course celebrated worldwide as one of Ireland's greatest writers. We're very honoured to have these two leading figures of the arts in Ireland here together, and it is now my honour to hand over to Garry Hynes.
Hello. Thank you very much for that introduction. I suppose I should start probably by outlining how DruidGregory came about. It was, we were preparing to do a season, Druid was preparing to do a season of one-act plays for a number of different reasons. First, I'm a particular fan of the one-act play, and they're very rare. 20th century one-act plays are very rarely done now. And in the second place, I was wondering what story of Ireland would a series of one-act plays from the 20th century tell? So these plays were all going very well. These plans were going very well until suddenly COVID struck, and everything was upended. So obviously all our plans, including the plans to produce these plays, had to be suspended. And then we began to look for a way to get back to live audiences as quickly as possible. So there germinated the idea of doing the Lady Gregory plays only and doing them outside in the grounds of Coole Park. This kind of seemed a rather outlandish idea in the beginning, but very quickly took root. And most of all, to our surprise, to everybody's surprise, actually happened. We were extraordinarily lucky with the timing, with the weather. We managed to avoid any suspension of performances. We lost 2 venues on a subsequent tour, but other than that, it all went ahead as planned. And Lady Gregory had been somebody I always knew, and obviously I knew her history with the Abbey and knew something of her, But when we began to prepare this project, I literally had an opportunity to really discover more about her and found her increasingly fascinating. I think my first real introduction to her as a figure came from a publication that I read in the early 2000s. I think the writer of that book and the title of the book attracted me first. It was called Lady Gregory's Toothbrush, and it was by Colm Tóibín. But it made me think of Lady Gregory anew, and I began to develop more interest in her. And that is really the context, I think, for DruidGregory. It was also extraordinary to see the same process as I had gone through with her happen to the actors who were involved in the project, from being a figure that they knew by the black and white profile photograph, to somebody they would have thought they didn't have much time for, or she was back there in history. It was wonderful to see the actors and indeed the audiences begin to fall in love with her and begin to want to know more about her. Obviously, the audiences had to be restricted. At one point, we were playing to audiences of only 15. But we hope to actually revive the project next year, and hopefully this time we'll be able to play to bigger audiences in Coole again.
Garry, how are you?
Hello, Colm, how are you?
Guys, it comes as a real shock in the Berg collection at the New York Public Library, where Lady Gregory's papers are, to come across a typescript of Cathleen Houlihan, and in pencil mark written, "All this mine alone, A.G." Yeah. And then later on, this with W.B.Y. A.G. And this was, of course, this was her becoming interested in her legacy. This was her preparing her papers many years later. I mean, at the time it was known. In other words, when Yeats stood on the Abbey stage and said, during the Playboy riots, and said, "I speak as the author of Cathleen Houlihan." Yeah. Someone in the audience noted, "That's funny. I always thought she wrote that."
Yeah.
And she then, when her daughter-in-law said, "You should start getting royalties for that or credit for that," she said, "No, it's the only successful play he's ever had. I wouldn't like to take it from him." And the second thing is that it was noted at the time when the play was first performed how dangerous it was. Yeah. It wasn't just in retrospect, or Yeats later on boasting, did those words of mine. On those very nights when people wrote about the play who were in the audience, said this is dangerous. This is actually insurrectionary and it's inflammatory. And Yeats and Lady Gregory more or less disappeared from Dublin. I mean, they disappeared. They didn't more or less. They left the city because they didn't want to be around for it. And it was noted who came into the hall, the audiences, the young men coming in, utterly fired up. And so just wondering at the beginning, just the first question really is, did that sense of the difference between now and then, of a play like that being able to, no one has any irony, no one has any waving distant from it, being able to come immediately and stir people up?
Yeah. I mean, I think you're saying exactly what we were saying when we were preparing it. It's a play everybody at least knows the title of, probably has seen, probably knows as a piece of history, probably know from Yeats saying, "Did this play of mine?" And yet when we were actually rehearsing it, we were taken aback by its directness and the context that it was played in, and knowing how potentially dangerous those times were, and how complex they were in relation to who you were, what your background was, and just sort of marveling over the fact that the play existed and was performed from 1902 onwards. We had arguments about the fact that did they not put her in prison, or him, for treason? Did Yeats's public persona protect them from such a move? But the directness of the play certainly had a huge effect on us in preparing it.
Well, but I'm also wondering is, stylistically, if the play set a sort of a template for what Irish writers would do later on. In other words, it isn't merely that it was written by Lady Gregory. It was that elements of it were written by Yeats. It came from a dream. It included a vision. It isn't just the sharp realism of a man getting married, a domestic space. And I'm wondering if even later in the work of, say, someone like Tom Murphy, that mixture of sharp realisms down to the dollar, down to the moment, and also a sort of visionary, incantatory sort of thread going through. If that is, so the play is actually stylistically also important and influential.
Well, I would imagine it is very, and this was one of the most interesting things about actually doing the plays, was, and I think doing the plays outside, I mean, did us a favor that we didn't know, in the sense that the plays seem, when you're reading them, very much of their time. And I think it would have been difficult if we had been doing them in a theatre. We'd have to make choices as to whether to liberate them from the dramaturgy or the stagecraft of the times, or to do something modern and relentless and radical with them. In a sense, having the plays performed outside against the background of the buildings in Coole Park allowed us to let the plays sort of stand on their own and not make any decisions that could sort of overly tell the audiences things about the plays, our choices about the plays themselves. But I think it's a really interesting point is that there's the huge domestic realism of the loaf of bread, the cut of bread on the table, and then this extraordinary sort of creature from outer space that comes down upon them and literally seduces their only child.
And she herself, there were times when she said that she didn't want Jailgate or The Rising of the Moon performed, that they would call Sedition, that she was alert to how dangerous they were. And there were moments, especially coming up after 1910, when she was worried about them. How did you approach that idea with, say, with Jailgate and Rising of the Moon?
I think
not that there's going to be Sedition.
I think it's more obvious in Rising of the Moon. I think in Jailgate, some elements, the plot is dependent on audiences understanding the nature, the nature of, informers, and what that it was better for somebody to die than be known as an informer, and so on and so forth. Whereas there's no doubt, there's no sort of ambiguity at all about Rising of the Moon.
So how did you approach that?
Well, our approach, when I say about, we did make one sort of major decision about Rising of the Moon, which was informed by the decision that in, I think, 1917, Lady Gregory herself went on, I think to everybody's dismay, to replace Maura Walker, who was ill, who was playing the role, and played it for 3 or 4 performances. And the context for DruidGregory was, in fact, Marie Mullen as Lady Gregory, and that people have often sort of said she looks like her, and we actually decided to have this character be, if you like, our guide through the plays and their physical settings. And Marie played the role of, played it as Lady Gregory in the play, which I think lent a certain, I don't know quite what it is, but there was an extraordinary consciousness, I think, of the theatrical construction of the role by having Marie as Lady Gregory play it.
I think that one of it is a great story, the story of Lady Gregory, how, she wasn't somebody who anyone thought was a writer, although she had edited various books and written various pamphlets, but that even when she said she would like to do the translation of the Táin, that Yeats said he didn't have time to do, Yeats wasn't sure she could. Yeats had no faith in her. Yeah. Really, what he wanted was a woman with a typewriter, which she had, and a big house. And so, but when she gave him the account of the Ferdia Cuchulainn battle, he realized that actually she was a writer.
Yes.
And then you watch her moving in and out of being a writer, being an administrator, coming and going. Some of the plays were really written as fillers, as sort of curtain raisers. and that she's always moving in and out of that role.
Yeah, I mean, it's all of those details I found extraordinary that I didn't know. I mean, the fact that she would be the writer, that the fact that, you know, and she said it herself, you know, if the rest of the repertoire is made up of Yeats plays, but if it were only Yeats, the Abbey would be empty. She said she was forced to write these little entertainments, and in order to keep the box office going, which they actually did in the first 10 years of the Abbey, from from a first performed to about 1914, 1916. And then at the same time, she was in her office. She heard there was only 2/3 of a house on. She would run down to the auditorium and reseat everybody so they came to the front and the house looked less empty than it would have done. And it was that sense of her as a working driver of a theatre that came as the biggest surprise to me, really.
Yeah, that journey from Coole to Dublin was not a journey by train. Sometimes it was an actual spiritual journey where she moved from being a landlady, and some of the letters to her bailiffs are really quite serious. I mean, she was quite serious about getting her rents paid and keeping Coole going for the next generation, being an Anglo-Irish, you know, leader. And then when she arrived in Dublin, then she suddenly had a whole new role, as you say, an administrator, but also that she had a vision. And it was her friends, her old Protestant friends, would say to her, "You're fighting for home rule," and she'd say, "No, I'm fighting for after home rule." Right. That she had a sense, which I suppose is something that I'm not suggesting that you had the same sort of vision, but the idea of running a theatre in a changing country, and of keeping the theatre free from day-to-day politics, but somehow or other trying to make a new country. Did you? I'm not asking you what you have in common with her, but I'm saying that idea of what the theatre does in a country is surely something that you must have, when you saw her vision of it, it must have meant something to you.
Yes, it did. I mean, and to say that when, you know, because I sort of probably in that first lockdown, I had the opportunity to read more or less everything about her, and you know, the detail of her work for the theatre and the detail of her day-to-day life, even in her journals alone, it did make me think, my God, this is familiar to me. She did things that I was doing in the first 10 years. And I was surprised at the fact that there was some sort of similarity between our experiences, because I would not have expected that. So, I mean, I ended up just, I think she was like marvelous, really, and quite extraordinary in the way she served so many, in so many different ways. I mean, as you said, she was a theatre administrator. She made sure, for instance, she got the letters patent for the Abbey. She managed, the ego of so many other people who were involved, including, of course, Yeats. And she managed her own estate on Coole, and she managed to celebrate the life of the area around her. It's an extraordinary life, and it seems to me, you know, it's wonderful now to see it as celebrated as it is. But sometimes I would think, and I began to think when I grew to know more about her, that she slightly obliterated by the fact that she was the founder of the Abbey. That, you know, you grow up knowing, you know, Yeats and Lady Gregory founded the Abbey. Yeats is the great poet whom everybody knows everything about. He's so celebrated. And in a way, she sort of, you know, even for somebody supposedly like me who knows something about it, she almost has this kind of a handmaid to Yeats. And that really, you know, you do have to because even as a theatre person, I wouldn't have the perception of her that I should have had, perhaps.
Could you give us a description? This is site-specific in Coole.
Yeah.
And for people who haven't been to Coole and who haven't seen the production, could you give us an idea of how you use the space, or what sort of style you used?
Yeah, well, basically what we did was find the settings for the 5 plays, or it was originally 7 plays, then 6 plays, and finally 5 that were actually performed, for the 5 plays in various different parts of Coole. And initially the major site was going to be the plinth, the cement platform, which was originally the house. And, you know, that was going to be the start of the journey, the end of the journey of the plays, and so on. Cathleen was to be performed on it. And then gradually, when we went out there to start teching them, we realized that, as somebody said, if you want to turn the outdoors into a theatre, then don't set it in woodland, because the trees going, the wind going through the trees made it impossible to perform there. So we actually had to abandon that and go to the sites where the remaining walls of the Haggard and various places actually helped project the voices. So we did it in various walled parts of the estate. And for instance, part of the kitchens and the outdoor rooms is overgrown and has 3 metal gates. And that was the setting for Jailgate. So it was a matter of Francis, our designer, actually looking at the various parts of the grounds, and we started then imagining the plays with very little intervention, just LED lights, sort of outlines of light. We wanted to communicate the fact that it wasn't Coole in just its natural way, but that there was a theatrical intervention, and that was light shapes that were used in each of the 5 sites to, if you like, give the suggestion of our presence as makers of plays.
So what do you do with the idea that the audience now is not the audience for the original audience for Cathleen the Houlihan, that people are unlikely to believe this, and that it has entered into the language in which, with the walk of a queen? How do you handle that distance between then and now?
I think it's very difficult to handle that distance. I don't think that the audience today can possibly have the same. I don't think the play can possibly communicate at all in anything even similar a way that it did then, that it did in say the first 10 years of performance. I think, unfortunately, the play is in a way locked into its history, and I can't see a situation other than a radical reinvention of it into another time, another language, whereby it could communicate. I think it stands now as a famous play, and the telling of the play is different.
Right. So then would there be a possibility of doing it so that the audience of the original audience becomes almost part of the moment, where people like Patrick Pearse in the audience being utterly inspired and sent out into the world by it?
That's a brilliant idea. Why didn't you talk to me?
You know, over the years, people would say, we'd love to do something by her, but can't find a play that would hold a modern audience. You know, that for example, Spreading the News just looks too flimsy. Could you just, like, for the future, putting her back into the canon?
I think she has to go back into the canon. You see, I think that's part of the problem, Colm. I think the fact, you see, the history of any play is inevitably has to be a history of performance, and she has no steady rate of performance. So I think that, you know, I think it's extraordinary that she's not performed more, and that she hasn't been. Well, I think it's extraordinary, really, that she hasn't been done by a national theatre. I think absolutely that Spreading the News, Hyacinth Halvey, they work as plays. I'm absolutely certain that McDonagh's wife works as a play. What I'm saying about Cathleen is that it's become too famous for its own good. It's 14 minutes of play that is just locked into its origins and its roots. As I said, I can see, for instance, a dance company making an extraordinary production of it, a Czechoslovakian company, a Russian company. But I think it has to be somewhere that is more removed from the roots of the play than we were in these circumstances.
There was a huge amount of rivalry, which we know, I think, from Synge's correspondence as much as anything else, between Yeats, Lady Gregory, and Synge over who wrote the good plays. And
Yeah.
Synge would go nuts if an American producer came into Dublin and they saw Yeats, Lady Gregory plays and not Synge's plays.
Yeah.
But I think, I know you've been thinking about Seán O'Casey for a long time, and now Lady Gregory, that achievement of hers, I mean, of all her achievements as an administrator, as a theatre person, I mean, running a theatre, the creation of Seán O'Casey really is an extraordinary achievement of hers, isn't it?
Absolutely. An incredible achievement. And again, the detail of which I was not really aware, the fact that they got on very well. They were very good friends. And there was something about the warmth of her friendship with him. And, one knows that he was a difficult and demanding character, and that she had a reputation of being cool and aloof. And they seem to have found some warmth in each other. I love his story of I think it's his story of arriving for his first visit to Coole, and they arrived in the carriage and pulled up in front of the house, and she lumbered down out of the carriage with great difficulty and walked a few steps ahead and turned around and faced him and said, "Céad míle fáilte to Coole, Seán." That she put on this huge show of welcome for him and used the Irish language. I think that's a great story that tells a lot about him and about her and about their relationship.
Yeah, I think it's very moving when he says, of all the things going on in Dublin, the Abbey was the thing that mattered to me. There were speeches given elsewhere. There was everything going on elsewhere. There were all sorts of rhetoric. It was in there that I got what made me. And then she turned down the first play, and then they had this extraordinary success.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the Silver Tassie was such a disaster because they were all in different countries as it was happening. The play was about to be published, and so he didn't want to make any changes. But it was a sort of disaster, wasn't it? The Silver Tassie.
It was a disaster because, like people often talk about it as a disaster for the Abbey, but I think it was a bit of a disaster for O'Casey as well, because, you could almost say that the Abbey was invented for Seán O'Casey. I mean, here you were going to found a national theatre, and along came this writer who was going to entirely engage himself in being a national writer, who was going to entirely put himself up against everything that word national means. And then the Abbey had such extraordinary success with the plays. And then they were cut off from each other. O'Casey no longer had a home. It was like he was evicted from the place that he turned into a famous home. And he was without a theatre for the rest of his life. He wasn't without success. He wasn't without financial success, but he even lived away from Dublin. And I've often thought of it as being a terribly sad story for both the Abbey Theatre and for Seán O'Casey.
Just
for
Irish
audiences.
To go back to Lady Gregory and Druid, could you give us an account of the Druid tours, of those tours of small towns and villages in the west of Ireland, and of what you would really hope to do with these plays in the future? I mean, next year. But you've been doing these tours that no one else has ever thought of, like a fit-up company.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, and it's very practical in its origin, because when Druid was founded in 1975, the population of Galway could not sustain continual theatre. It couldn't even do that now. So in order to become a full-time theatre, we had to find audiences elsewhere. And we found them basically in our own next door neighbourhoods. I had been working on the amateur circuit when I was in college, and we knew that there were audiences in places like Clifton, Loughrea, Athlone, and so on. And it really became an essential part of Druid. So with, say, the Lady Gregory plays, we went to, for instance, Ballyglunan is a place not far from Coole. It's about, I don't know, about 10 or 15 miles. It's a crow flies. It's a small community, and it was once it's a train station, and we performed in the community there with the audiences on the platform of with the play on the platform of the station, and the audience sitting on the tracks. And we go into local halls, we go outside, wherever we can pull together an audience, we go there. We did the same thing with Waiting for Godot. We performed it outdoors in Meáin, in the Cage Fields in Mayo. I mean, what happens in places like that is that it becomes an event in itself. I mean, when people enter into a theatre, by definition, even if they enter into a small theatre like our own theatre, by definition, they observe certain rituals of going into a building and absorbing the fact they're in a playhouse and about to watch a play. When you pop up and do them in places that people have never heard of or never seen plays before, or outdoors or whatever, it changes the nature of the experience. Sometimes not for the good. Sometimes that doesn't work, but it's always a challenge, and it's very much part of what we do and how we do it at this point.
Just one more final thing. There's a wonderful moment where Lady Gregory is on Meáin, and so is Synge, but they don't know each other.
That's right.
This is in the last years of the 19th century, and they just don't know each other. They don't like the idea of each other. There's another Protestant intellectual on the island looking for energy from this strange energy source of Meáin, and they literally pass one another by.
Yeah.
But then, of course, but she has gone there on her own as a widow in her early 40s, really to learn Irish. In the public library, New York Public Library, you can see her like tall and bow, like she's writing out all the Irish words, and she has her Bible in Irish, but she knows so well in English. Yeah. And so I think the island, that middle island for you, has been a very important source, hasn't it, of inspiration and energy. And it's a place that Druid has gone back to again and again.
It really has. We went first there, I think, in about 83 or 84, and because Synge was kind of at the heart of the company's experience in being, it was one of the premier plays we did opening plays we did in 1975, and then we became so passionate, we said, if we survive as a company, we'll go back to Synge, which we did in the early 80s, and if we're to do Synge, then we must go to Meáin with Synge. And as a result of that, we've developed a kind of a real relationship with the island, but an imaginative relationship with the island, which has been hugely enriching for us as a company.
Okay, I think we can take questions. There's one question here was saying, are there any hidden gems? I mean, a play that you could say to any theatre, this is a play by Lady Gregory, that, look, you've really got to do this.
I think that McDonagh's Wife was the hidden gem for me. And it's basically the return of a man who's known as a sort of pipe player to find that his wife is dead, and there are two characters. They're called old crones, or I can't exactly remember. Anyhow, we decided to have them played by two young women. And in that case, we really had to reinvent the play. And the lyricism of the play and the power of the play, like, really, really took us back. It's a powerful piece of work. Her language, her use of language, her Kiltartanese, for want of a better word, is at its most powerful. And she's been very ambitious in what she's setting out to do in the play.
There's a Miles is asking, do you have a sense of what her vision was? If it wasn't political, it wasn't about precisely home rule. What was her vision?
Her vision, I think our vision, I think it was a cultural vision, wasn't it? I mean, her realization that there was a culture there which might be oral, might not be, which was a total contrast to what her understanding of culture would have been before then. This written sort of, established culture. And I think her kind of finding of that, and her searching and constant research and discovering people and discovering things, I think that was the passion of her life, really.
Yeah, I think she loved the battle, and she began the battle to really have Irish put onto the school curriculum. And then a professor in Trinity College said there were no ideals in ancient Irish literature.
Yes,
he produced a book called Ideals to show him how many of these ideals there were. And that battle then began, the battle she would call to add dignity to Ireland.
Yes, that's right.
Say to the landlords, you have people who are paying rents to you, who actually are speaking modern Irish, which is as close to Old Irish as modern Greek is to ancient Greek.
Yeah.
They're in possession of an extraordinary rich heritage. And they are not, in a way, enfeebled by the famine, or they're not a sort of a potentially violent faction-fighting group. They actually have a dignity. And that was what mattered to her.
Yeah, and I mean, that was extraordinary that she did that, and the degree to which she did that, learning Irish. I mean, her teacher was a woman called Miss Borthwick, or one of her teachers was a woman. So that was just extraordinary, the English name teaching her Irish. But she went and learned Irish. I mean, how difficult that must have been. It's difficult for most people even today if your original language is English and you're trying to learn Irish, as every school child of my generation knows. But that she would do that in that place at that time just shows what steel there was in the woman.
Yeah. I love the idea that sometimes when she needed to know what a word meant, she would send out into the yard and she would bring in a local and she would say to him, could you, this word here, could you, and he would know what it meant. He would go off working again and she would continue translating.
And I don't know if it's true or not, but one wants to believe that she did have a slight lisp and quite a high voice. And to hear her speaking Irish, I just wish there was a recording of it. I would have loved to have heard it.
Stella Brown says that she saw McDonagh's wife performed in Colm Abbey. Oh, that's amazing. And then I said it was those two young female actors were outstanding. Said McDonagh's wife was a real gem, was very powerful, and so obviously you got a response for that. And
Colm Abbey was kind of extraordinary because it's the antithesis of Coole in the sense that the building built there has survived, but very much came off the same roots in the sense it was built by a rich Manchester merchant in the middle of the 19th century. So to do it in the kind of polished surroundings, if I can use such a word, of Colmore, and find the plays leap into life in a different way there than they did at Coole. It was a good experience.
There's just something coming up there that you said about Kiltartnese. You know, there was a certain moment when it was really very fashionable to laugh at everything that she did as a translation. That, in other words, for example, the foreword to the translation of Cuchulainn really did talk about her as a woman of the house, sharing her food with people.
Oh, that's hilarious.
Ludicrous. Yeah. Yeats calling it the greatest book to come out of Ireland in my time.
Yes.
Actually, it had an enormous influence that nobody had thought of translating ancient Irish texts into a vernacular, into a living speech.
Yes.
And Synge in Pearse, for example, when he read it, it opened an extraordinary amount of space for him that he didn't have before.
Yeah.
And that, as you say, at its best, is astonishingly rich and powerful. And when in a way, I learned this courtesy of you. In other words, that when I saw your Playboy, I think I've seen all of your Playboys, I was amazed at how the young actors, that you could see on the street were coming in and speaking this as both heightened poetry and vernacular living speech. And that you actually worked with it as a plastic thing, as a thing you could really get drama from.
Well, absolutely. I mean, that's, why Synge became so central so quickly. But then again, in going now to Lady Gregory, you do discover those timescales that Lady Gregory was doing it before he did it, that he was marveling at it. And would Synge have existed without her? Would Synge, who is acknowledged as one of the great writers in the English language, would Synge have been Synge without Lady Gregory? That's not a thought I would have had up to this year and the experience of doing these plays. And I do hope that, I do really hope that one of the things that happens is the plays are done more frequently, because I'm quite sure that there are young people who make theatre out there now who could take on a lot of these plays. There's plus 40 of them. And by sort of bringing the imagination of today, not just their history, to them in a perhaps more direct way, show us something that we haven't seen before.
Yeah, I mean, you did that years ago with, say, M.J. Malloy, who was a playwright that people thought he belonged to the 40s or 50s. And you did The Whispering in a very modern and, I mean, not exactly experimental, but nonetheless, it was a contemporary production of The Wood of the Whispering, which I think changed how everyone viewed his work.
Well, Michael is renowned himself, Michael Malloy himself, for what his comment was after the first performance, the first preview. And he said, he said, it resembles the play I wrote once, he said, at the production of the play.
But that is in a way, that's what directors do. I mean, that's what should happen to the Lady Gregory canon, isn't it?
That's right. That's absolutely right. And I'm quite sure, and there's a whole, I think, journey to be made through the plays there. And I'm sure she, I'm sure she did so many new things in her life. I'm sure she would mind at all if people picked the plays up and took them on and asked them to stand up and answer for themselves.
Garry Hynes, thank you very much.
Thanks, Colm. Thank you.
Thank you.